Hello everyone, today we talk about the islands in Gaul during the 5th century. The history of these people we covered already in the migration era peoples series dedicated episode. As a matter of fact, we talked about Sarmatian warfare also on other occasions. I will create surely, or I already have, if I'm not wrong, an Iranian history and warfare playlist, but we have never really delved with this part, let's say, of Alanian history. We surely addressed it in the general video. This people scattered right after the Hunnic migration, in great part towards the west, where it settled in some places. Gaul, Spain. The Romans used them as auxiliaries, as we will see now. Great part of the Arthurian mythology, the Excalibur, the Iranian mount, sword cult, really having a lot to do with that in this specific age. So we will surely observe these things, hopefully, over time, a bit more in depth. Never talk about the Arthurian age, but there is something to dig there. And I would like to concentrate today on the role, especially that the Alans had in Gaul as invaders initially, but also as faithful foederati for the Roman Empire. And this aspect, transcends now others that we'll see perhaps in a second video regarding the legacy of the Alans, just generally speaking, what was of them in Gaul specifically, because as you know, a chunk went on to the most famous one, to Spain and Africa, especially with the Vandals, and they were fundamentally absorbed. Like, the Alans didn't settle as an entire people. Some of them remained actually in part of their not really ancestral lands that really were in Central Asia originally, but north of the Caucasus, right? So where tradition says that, of course, gave birth also to Ossetian people / language, and there is all a very hardcore history of Alan warfare that mostly has to do with, initially, with the Alans being essentially the toughest, the strongest, properly incarnation of the Indo-European knighthood. So much so that to these Iranian men-at-arms we owe also a consistent part of, if anything, not of the genesis proper, but of the revival of what we call at least as medieval chivalry or medieval knighthood, in the way we came to intend it, say, later on, but later also essentially as retinues, as bodyguards of emperors that go from, as we will see now, the Roman ones, the Mongol ones, the Chinese ones, but until very late in time. So what I can measure as essentially the most intense identitary military tradition in the history of mankind, right? There is to dig there, because especially after, say, from classical times, we have this ethnographic understanding that is somehow, however, vague for the peoples who inhabited the steppes. Later, this people was in part crushed, so also finding, the type of expertise necessary to browse all these pages of history, as you understand, throughout basically great part of the ancient one and almost all the medieval one is something even more complex, right? So, but starting from the Gallo-Roman context can help us understand better the role of this population that, albeit, as we're saying here, minor compared to the larger groups such as the Franks, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the same Huns, played a significant political and strategic role that looks basically at the balance of the Western Roman Empire on the basis of the quality of these warriors, right? So this was war bands, and a great part of their settlement, we've seen it even in the video about the origins, say the theory of Serbian origins, ethnically, historically speaking, but they had settled in several areas, right? In Central, Western, Southern Europe, leaving traces such as we'll see now, toponyms, even emblems. There's a town in Portugal, for example, whose coat of arms that bears some symbolism of that kind. The same Alan dog that it would be the Great Dane, right? To aside from the various further selections, would be basically this massive war as hunt hound used by this terrifying knights, warlords of the steppes. So the same Excalibur, for example, if you think about the role played in, say, British culture as a whole, because of course that's mostly like a sort of Romano-Celtic thing, but it has evidently this much, say, these Iranian, so much more distant connections. And we could go on, but again, time is limited, so I can't do it all in one video. And I think the Gallic situation is just very fascinating to look at in relative depth. Now, there isn't even much about these peoples legitimately in Gaul, because of the relatively small amount that settled there. We have made videos here and there about Roman Gaul during the 5th century that was basically, if not the most, at least surely one of the most advanced countries in Europe during the 6th century, was definitely the richest one in absolute terms, say quantitatively speaking. It had throughout its history, also in early medieval times, like a radical continuity. In fact, with the Gallo-Roman background, even under the Franks, the Burgundians, the Goths, and its political and social characteristics are fundamentally known, right? There is a balance. There is still the maintenance of virtually intact of the latifundium system, and so more or less the church inherited with the senators here. That is essentially the same thing, as part of the same families. So there was a general sense of regional awareness. Gaul, like in Roman times, had a quite proudly distinguished, again, level of Romanization, but also of, in fact, an active one, right, in which the natives had participated successfully in the process. They had gained a very strong place in the empire, in the army, and that were thus continuing this great imperial legacy, even when seceding. There are these episodes like the ones with Tetricus, etc., never actually going against Rome, against Italy, from a strategical point of view. Their point was defending the Rhine frontier, keeping things running smoothly and fundamentally coexistent in that picture. Rather than the Frankish conquest, properly the establishment of the Merovingian Empire was possible thanks to this this immediate alliance between the church and Clovis, and so the baptism of the ruler, and consequently also the rest of the Franks, straight from paganism into Catholicism, differently from the Goths, for example. I made multiple videos about this topic, and surely we'll have to come back on it. And so, especially in the early phase, like of Merovingian history, like the late 5th, the early 6th century, like the continuation also in the army, etc., of many systems. We've seen it in the video about the Frankish army organization, the early period. But this is a part that we will see, if anything, I think not even in the second video, because it pertains to a time in which the alliance had been diluted enough that had become not just loyal foederati, but given that the empire was not controlling them anymore, essentially proto-feudal landlords, like the Gallo-Roman Germanic nobility. So the importance of Gaul, politically and strategically during the 5th century, we'll see Attila's invasion, and there the connection with the Iranian peoples who had been fleeing, right, including the Alans that had been basically crushed by the Huns, at least as an independent people. That reveals the centrality of Gaul in the Roman imperial policy and the way they were organizing the frontier there, right, in which the Alans played a pivotal role. So, as we were saying before, the Alan origins will not just stay in this, but say that there were people stemming from the depths of Central Asia that were essentially the single most warlike ones, the ones who had maximized the shock charge effect of their cavalry, developed the most advanced weaponry and armor. Look at these warriors' fish scales that had already been fighting against the Romans from centuries, and that had a power stretching from initially the Don and the Volga rivers, essentially defeating the other Iranian groups of the Sarmatians that ruled until the Danube, but in fact stretching up to there, right, and the Caucasus, and launching raids again, in fact, in Rome, on the Roman Danube, or in the Caucasus, further south, I mean, in the Near East and so on. So lots of military historical relations, of course, with the Romans that had always naturally maintained the upper hand. So the Alans really obliged the Romans to take measures, even strategically, but also adopting some of their weapons, armor, tactics, if anything, because the same Alans were hired by the Romans at a point. But of course, also receiving, and this is what I exemplified, at least in the series about Eurasian steppes warfare, a lot from the Romans back. In fact, these tactics, these shock tactics, had been developed exactly to cope with the heavier, stronger infantries of the sedentary civilizations. And so at that point, gravitating around Rome was, of course, the biggest deal for any people living, in fact, at the outskirts of the golden empire, the golden era that they had established, trying to be part of that as well, right? Our Alans again witnessed among the Roman auxiliaries. We know some of their units, where they were distributed, etc. Today we stick just to the Gallic ones. Again, we can easily talk about them in another video, but I don't have time for it today, and I want to keep things tidy. Right, so the Alans had been the single most successful Iranian people to some degree, at least in the New Age, let's say, marked by the rise of the Sarmatians over the Scythians historically, and were warriors of the highest renown, as we pointed out. However, they were subjected, like all the nomadic peoples, to this constant turmoils of the steppes, and they were conquered in the latter part of the 4th century by the Huns, with an upheaval that, as you know, had struck the same Rome because of the domino effect, the Irano-Germanic peoples reversing themselves into the Roman frontier, managing even to defeat the imperial army at Adrianople, out of which they eventually would have become known with some significant change as the Visigoths, entering as the first single people, right, provided, in fact, with a political autonomy, but still as a nomadic one within the empire, and an avalanche of these other groups that, however, had, again, already been hired by the Romans. I made some videos about Theodosian times, about Gratians, even some policies, religious policies of the empire regarding Catholicism or Arianism had to do with the sense of barbarism that some emperors provoked say the establishment with by having, I don't know, being Aryan and having an Alan bodyguard, just to show off in that regard. Alan contingents served in the armies of Gratian, Theodosius the Great, Stilicho, and they were pretty much everywhere. Like we don't have the track of every single warband, of course, that was employed by the Romans, by the Germans, by the Huns, etc. But they were just very, very popular in that regard, and they figured essentially as picked elite forces of some kind within this broader populations. Other groups of fugitive Alans joined the confederacy of the Suebi and one of the Vandals that from Central Europe, traditionally on this date, December the 31st, 406, crossing allegedly the frozen Rhine, essentially broke through Gaul, breaching through the Roman defenses, also the Germanic ones, because, for example, the Franks were acting as foederati. They tried to stand this. There were other peoples in between, the Alemanni, the same Burgundians, that at some point had a mixed role in all this. Consider that, again, warbands of all these peoples were, again, distributed among all these people, so you could easily find, say, connationals of the same individual gentes fighting against one another, and so on. 406, as you know, is the moment in which this mass, like this horde of peoples, including part the same foederati that at that point realized there was nothing really that could be done to hold this guy, so it was better even just to seize further territory in Gaul, swarmed into the Roman Empire. They crossed into, like, they scattered into Gaul and into Spain and then Africa, etc. And we have, in this context, in 407, Goar, one of the Alan reges, let's say kings, deserting, however, the horde, right, of this Central Eastern Europeans with his followers to become an ally of Rome. Naturally, here the situation is as messed up as complicated, meaning that Rome, of course, always had a dialogue with these groups, right? So it was easy, considering their level of, say, political and, say, military compaction, to detach some elements like the chiefs. They didn't really have a real monarchy yet, right? So when we talk about kings in this case, that are single chieftains, warlords, with a substantial retinue, wealth, reputation, cattle, what they have been able to seize across the migration, and they are very tough, because these guys, again, come from the Barbaricum, so even, say, here we're not talking about just the elite of the Alans, but the same Germans, right? They were warlike peoples, habituated to the greatest types of strengths. They were properly peoples in arms, and as such, they also made great enemies as much as great allies, right? Whenever they could be won over. And that, generally speaking, and differently from the more savage Turkic and properly nomadic Huns, that they really never had much of a chance to establish themselves in a sanitary way, nor even more to make anything of late antiquity working on. We're actually very interested and looking forward to live within Romanity, right? This, as we will see, means different things. Of course, they weren't just dreaming to become Roman subjects. They wanted to maintain their own autonomy, just like the Goths had done. Here, it's all in the with the Hunnic invasion in the background, because either you were under the Huns or under Rome, right, with some degree of autonomy, but still nominally. Now, so the Alans, in this case, at least the ones, the most of them followed the Vandals in the Suebi, right? But Goar, representing a minority, but still a substantial one, decides to side with Rome in this Gallic context. Again, good land, right? If you come from places like, I don't know, in fact, the aforementioned Ukraine, southern Russia, the Caucasus, etc. Well, a place like Gaul is really like a 5-star, or a 4-star if you want to be less generous. But it's one of the best lands you've ever seen in your entire life, if not the best one in the first place, if it hadn't been for the incredible globe trotting that naturally all these war bands did regularly. Like all these peoples we are naming here had been serving in the Roman army with individual mercenaries, war bands, etc., or fighting against the Romans for centuries. Right, so it was not a surprise to anyone. They retained different lifestyles because the two spaces were substantially different, but they knew well each other. Right, and this guy knows how Roman politics works and decides to side with Rome to gain, of course, some advantage, because fixing that guy, like having it, defending some areas on behalf of the empire is quite advantageous for Rome. The Vandals and the Suebi, as we know, actually plundered throughout Gaul. In 409 they cross into Spain. That's especially in the south where they have problems of cohesion. They start ravaging harder there, and finally they went even to Africa. So that branch of the Vandals was eventually absorbed, especially in fact by the Vandals, but they scatter a bit all over the Iberian Peninsula as well. In any case, what we care about today is Gaul and Goar as a first example of this loyalty to the imperial cause. Right, the normal way to stabilize these peoples was to grant them the so-called hospitalitas, so settling them in the Roman territory and conferring them essentially the resources were traditionally customarily paid to the Roman forces that evidently here had either evaporated or at least had been crushed and dispersed, whatever. So to act as a local garrison, as a local field army even, right? If you're talking about larger peoples like, I don't know, the Visigoths, right? At best they would have had 30,000 warriors, right? As able-bodied freemen in the larger within the larger population. And you understand it was hard for all these peoples, right? The 30,000 men is the size of a field army, as a matter of fact. So if you lose a major battle, you're going to have severe problems from terms of manpower, of political cohesion, right? And there are occasions, in fact, in which these peoples are almost until the very end of the Western Roman Empire. Think about Majoran, we will see it now, wiped out and resettled somewhere else. Goar was settled in an area that we can identify through the toponymy, bearing quite evidently in France the name of the islands. We have Allen on the Somme, Elencourt on the Aisne, Alincourt in the Ardennes. So here is the broader Belgica, right? We're talking about this essentially more militarized, less popularized chunk of Gaul, right? Having like a crescent, like from the Channel to Switzerland, basically. That was in fact the one that still hosted most of the Roman foederati that still were guarding the frontier, in spite of the aforementioned breakthrough, because there were still other peoples from the other side, and I don't know, the Franks, the Burgundians, were considered themselves lucky in just having Roman land, doesn't matter how depopulated and somehow less developed in that sense, but still, right, much better than what was from the other side. we have Alamont on the Meurthe et Moselle, Elincourt, La Côte on the Moselle, Elincourt-Boeuf, that is in Meurthe et Moselle, and Alincourt in Haute-Saône in the south, the latter. And this distribution is quite meaningful because you realize that these settlements form a literal belt that basically overlaps with a sort of second line of defense. The first one would still be the Rhine, right? But if you get towards, essentially, we were talking about the same areas. These are small towns, if not villages, today. So we're lucky just to see there the reference, the old reference to the Alans preserved toponymically. They're not, say, particularly important centers now, but we're talking about them the other day because they are scattered even pretty close to places like Paris, Reims, etc. And altogether, across this river net, that includes the Seine, the Marne, the Somme, the Meuse, the Moselle, and that was just behind the, in fact, Franco-Burgundian frontier, right? So sort of again, like if the Franks and Burgundians were on the front, they had to bear the brunt of the whatever onslaught was coming from the east, and we're talking the Huns here, while the Alans were essentially used as a mobile elite reserve that had to operate through internal lines, through these layers of rivers to inflict to wear out the enemy, inflict the final strike. In the best case scenario, right? Things would go, say, a bit in a different way. Also, we pointed out that the Alans weren't really that many, right? But they were still highly considered, and this is a great indicator of quality in that regard. The Germans were not as chosen. They had their own elite, right? But they were larger peoples and were settled through different procedures. Here it seems that the Alans were chosen specifically in a much more scientifically and strategically chosen way. There are some indicators to point it out. For example, the distance between these various settlements, that is always something like 20, 25, 30 miles. So it's one you can't cover in one day, right? Especially if you have the fierce mounted contingents that the Alans were famous for. So to operate a sort of blitzkrieg and carrying out a very effective defense in depth, striking on the enemy flanks during across the route of advance, things like that. Here, like just with a map, you can appreciate the distance, but there are different. It's a fairly fortified area. There are lots of river crossings, so the Alans are entrusted with a significant amount of control, even as far as the relation with the Franco-Burgundian foederati was entailed. They were just closer to the Roman government that was naturally operating from the more central areas of Gaul still at the time, in spite of the significant autonomization that had already taken place in the Saint-Sarmatian settlement being the measure of it. This is proven by the very interesting role that the aforementioned Alan chief Goar, together with the Burgundian one Gundahar, had in the support of Jovinus' usurpation. This was a Roman leader who took the purple at Monson, a town some 30 miles east of the Burgundian capital at the time of Varennes, and some 75 miles northeast of the Alan settlement of Elincourt on the Aisne. Jovinus failed eventually in his endeavors. It's likely at this point that the Alans and other foederati who had signed it with him reestablished essentially the previous relations with the say legitimate Western Roman Emperor, and so maintaining essentially their conditions of service the rule over the land, the defense of the place. And it's obvious that already at this point they had been installing themselves de facto as local lords. Right? This had been possible for the collapse of the Rhine frontier in the 5th century. This was an open and vast region, and this military force could also find some significantly civilized establishment to essentially negotiate the conditions of the hospitalities. Goar, in this regard, is considered probably so normal in his role that he did not attract more than much the attention of the contemporary historiographers, right? So that his followers even are not heard of for some 30 years even. So that means that the process of settlement had been accomplished without major troubles. Things were working in many ways like before the invasion, and the fact that they sided with Jovinus, right, is not, let's say, a less faithful move than being simply siding with the empire, right? As we were saying before, probably the Gallic, the Romano-Gallic ideal of, say, a rule of Gaul defending the frontier from the barbarians, etc., was perfectly compatible with in this case, an allied cooperation as foederati locally, and it served everybody's interest in the region. In 414, we have another group of Alans in alliance with the Visigothic king Ataulf, described as besieging the Roman-held town of Bazas. We are in the southwest of Gaul. And the striking aspect here, you understand, it's again a group, right? Perhaps it's even too much to call it a tribe, but still, it's a significant military force that, at the following of the Visigoths, breaks with their Germanic allies to do what? To side with the Romans in the process. So here the Visigoths that have been settled just after the sack of Rome and the death of Alaric in Aquitaine, fundamentally, in southwestern Gaul, are taking over like a bit more autonomously other important Roman towns in the area, and the Alans at their following decide to side with the empire in this circumstance, which is fascinating. Now, it would be interesting to ask ourselves why, right? Because no Alan left us an actual, say, account, right? Why they were doing what they were doing. My theory is that there may have these were obviously politically, say, contingently dictated choices. Right, there wasn't any particular, ideal behind these sidings, but just the one that would be more convenient for these chieftains. But from one side, first of all, you see that the Alan identity, doesn't matter how minoritary from a numerical point of view within the Germans, still has the strength to stand out for itself and essentially operating independently. Secondly, you notice this constant siding with the empire, which may have partially something to do with something that in part also the Germans shared, but that at a point was perhaps more pressuringly declined, like on the base of the necessity of larger peoples within Roman territory, of siding with the bigger, with the universal, with the world empire, right? Rome here was felt by anyone involved still as the medium with God, and thus the ennobling process that could bring these people to be divinely transfigured, they even partake in the same empire, right? As they were somehow believing. But again, the sense that these peoples had done as auxiliaries, that this was the master empire, the one that had accomplished the thing. It doesn't matter whether, especially in the West, it was falling apart, and so was making these peoples ever bolder to say, we took over the Roman Empire, in the sense that we are the ones wielding it, right? This is something that you find consistently pursued by, by the same Franks, by the Merovingians, who took everything from Rome as much as they could, the imperial vicary of the Gauls, the pallium, all the possible Roman imperial symbols, to boast them as de facto still, say, call them subjects, but active partakers properly, as they would see themselves as a sort of chosen race of warriors that was worth that, that role of command as lords, but that eventually didn't control as much as what still existed as the empire. Even so, don't think that this whole sense of Romanity and imperiality ended with the Western half. This is a myth, right? You have 10th century Anglo-Saxon Bretvalda that called themselves Basileus, right? By that time, by Byzantine influence. So the concept that there's never been such a thing like the end of the empire is pretty evidently clear, right? But not just the empire as the Holy Ghost, that all these people mastered in their own celestial religion, but the Roman one by that point, and especially in these contexts where, of course, the most prestigious reward was Roman land. And do not underestimate in this regard the fact that the Alans were, here I didn't stress it enough, but if you think that the Germans were the warlike, cocky, strong, kind of fanatic people, well, you may want to check what the Alans were in comparison, because this was the single most unspeakingly and traumatically brutal, violent, and most single zealotic kind of vision of world universal heavenly domination, right, falling from the golden ray, from divinity itself. Like, the Alans embodied this. They're from their mouths, from their arms and armor, from their lifestyle, they top any other people existing here, including, in an individual sense, the same Huns, right, the same Turkic waves that are starting essentially to take over the Indo-European ones in the steppes themselves. So the Alan vestige is something incredible. Like, if you look at it in perspective in the history of mankind, and of course people's say characters like Goar or this group detaching itself from the Visigoths, would see themselves, of course, much better than anyone else here, but by significant scale and quality, right? So in 414 here, in this Southern Gallic context, you have an agreement made by which the Alan warriors, who were accompanied by their families, by the way, were given lands and settled in southern Gaul to preserve the Roman peace against this other bit less loyal foederati of the empire. This is a particularly serious deal between Rome and this group. We're talking here about also toponyms showing the Alan influence. We have Alan in the Haute-Garonne, Alaigne on the Aude, which are in fact the two main centers where the Alans are settled, and they are very close to the Pyrenees, so very, say, strategic location upstream, by the way, to the Garonne, and so for southeast compared to Bazas, that instead is from the Atlantic watershed, and so meaning that this land where the Romans had, where the Alans had settled, was the most Romanized, right? People say, Aquitaine was so Roman, because we made videos about medieval Aquitaine, etc. Also made lots of videos about late antique Aquitaine, in a way, the Visigothic relation with local populations, etc. And we say we're so Roman just because they differed from the northern French, like essentially the descendants of the Franks, say spiritually speaking. But there was let's say the reason why we call Aquitaine in great part places like Toulouse, etc. are significantly they're from the Mediterranean side. Is that Diocletian repartition, right, recompaction of various provinces that historically weren't, in that case, Aquitaine, right? The area around Narbonne on the Mediterranean was the ancient Gallia Narbonensis, in fact. Aquitaine was a much wilder place on the Atlantic side, comparatively. They were still significantly, at this point, Romanized and urbanized places. But the true heart of that Occitanian Romanity was on the western side, the one here in which the Alans are brought, whereas the Visigoths were from the Atlantic side of the story. So this is a big win for these guys, because even the Roman authorities that still have their militias when not properly, field armies passing by there, etc., can now use these Alan knights as sort of picked elite, and not elite also numerically, so not seeing them as a threat, like an extensive settlement, also demographically speaking. Think about the Visigoths, as we were saying before, really represented, that had been quite a pain in the behind, like also between west and east before things tilted towards the former, right? Also in this case, for 25 years, we do not know much about the Alans in Gaul, showing that they were essentially integrated in the system. They likely remained peaceful in their settlements. They remained loyal to the empire. They simply lorded over from their own towns, that they're fortified, their citadels, and just letting the Romans, as usual, as it happens in these contexts, running their lives normally, also because it was the single most convenient thing to do, and that's why these peoples had come there in the first place. However, in 440 we have another machinations by which Etzius, the famed Roman general, settled a group of Alans, yet another one, of Alans, under its chief, Sambida, in the Valentinois. So essentially this area would be between the Dauphiné and Burgundy. I made videos about these places for the later Middle Ages on their own. That is also famous because of later, the Borgias, in the Renaissance, and other reasons. This was at the time it's apparently a normal district, an average district, but it does have a significant strategic value that we will see now. And also here we find the modern town of Alan, the Drôme, some 30 miles to the south of Valence, that after which the land was called the Valentinois in the first place, marking essentially the Alan settlement. Or at least we are fairly confident that whenever we see, and we have a significant of this, these leaders settle exactly in this area, we find there the name Alan, surprise, surprise, well, we can go safely assuming that maybe this was not the single most important center that we may not know of, but surely it was one of the most important for maintaining the name of the Alans, right? Because if these guys had just come by and moved at some other point, you wouldn't have all these names located exactly where we know the Alans were located. So throughout the ages, there was a significant legacy left by the Alans in loco, and we can assume that these were de facto the districts in which they were centered. Just as a military presence, naturally was scattered across other castles, villages, and so on, just for the sake of, say, territorial control, etc. 2 years later, in 442, Aetius provides for yet another group of islands, settlements, this time in the Orléanais and to further north. So we are on the Loire, at the border of essentially two cultural areas. North you have the Belgica, right, and then some of the least Romanized areas in Gaul, and yet Orléans especially is so central, right, on the Loire. You can reach through here some properly the periphery, like in a radiant fashion of northern Gaul. And this is, as you understand, a mean that Aetius had to control the far north of Gaul through such likely highly mobile force, like the islands could ferociously strike in their nomadic, primitive ways, right? But still quite effectively against the various rebels that were harassing, in fact, Roman rule from north to south, such as the Bacchaudi. The towns in this case are Hellenville en Beauce, in Loiret, Allen in Eure-et-Loire, Hellenville in Eure-et-Loire, Hellenville, yet another one in Loirel, and Les Halles in the Eure, as well as, and this is the most prestigious settlement, in fact, of Orléans herself, right? These are, by the way, just the settlements that we can identify because either we know of or because they have the name Alan into the French toponym, right? So Aetius surely at this point was reorganizing some Alan forces that already existed in Gaul. So these were not, at least largely, like made up of new war bands that were coming from somewhere, right? These were partially the maybe the same Goar and some of his followers who had previously lived in northeastern Gaul, right? Moving them, centering them in this area that again is much more effective to control a substantial amount of territory, both south and north. You see, the settlement in Valentinois along the lower course of the Rhone, as much as the one in the Orléanais on the Loire to the north, had specific strategic importance. The reason why Aetius needed new forces in that context was not just the threat that, generally speaking, was coming from the outer world, say of the Barbaricum, or just territorial control, but the fact that by this point he could not really rely still on his Hunnic auxiliaries that had also played a significant part, for example, in the crushing and deportation of the Burgundians. I mean, the Nibelungenlied basically talks about that, when the Germanic epos eventually made the final showdown in Vienna with Attila, because Attila was, had a historical, legendary, anthropological meaning. But we think that the story actually refers to Aetius and the fact that the Burgundians were crushed by the Huns, but the auxiliary ones at the service of the Romans in Gaul. The Burgundians were a bit, being a bit ambiguous, let's put it in this way, because they had remained, of all these groups, had remained basically stationed across the Danube. They were basically the only people that was a bit like you didn't understand whether we're siding with Attila or with Rome, and so Aetius is pissed off by this. He crushes them and deports them into Sepaudia, where they would essentially remain. The Burgundian kingdom would be established. And the Huns, however, had now gained a significant autonomy on their own, because Attila's power was rising fast, so some were recalled and were becoming too unreliable per se, and they were just a bunch essentially of nomadic raiders in that way. Good soldiers, admittedly, there's no doubt, but still, of mixed mixed loyalty. The Alans that were better integrated, and already so, by the way, in Gaul represented a much more important ally to Rome. Now, this aspect is fascinating because aside from the hostility that obviously existed in general between the Huns and the Alans, given that the former had destroyed their abodes in the Pontic steppe, and that's the reason why the Alans were in Gaul in the first place. There had been, as we were saying before, also a process of civilization that peoples like the Sarmatians had, like after a prolonged existence at the Roman frontier. They had remained essentially semi-nomadic, but say a semi-nomad of the first century BC is significantly different in the Pontic steppe from the one, say, of the 5th, right? So the Alans had become, among the other things, already more integrable than the Huns, say. And they were, at this point, acting au pair with the same Germans, and instead were peoples of much older sedentarization in spite of their recent movements. The settlements in the Orléanais and to the north were created in part, as we were saying, to provide garrisons which could keep the Armorican Bacaudae under control. We're talking about Brittany, so the northwest of Gaul, a region that, like a bit like all the Celtic fringes in Britain, Gaul, Spain, etc., had remained, were superficially Romanized. And they had not given too much trouble, but in this time of gradual weakening of imperial rule in the frontier began to trigger, also because of their scarce development, a sort of social revolt of some sort. They were just like a mix between brigand. There were different things at the same time. At some point they were peasants rebelling, at some point they were brigands. I mean, not really, freedom fighters in the romantic sense you would imagine, but still having something to do with the destabilization also of the societal structures, especially in this frontier areas, and launching raids in the richer, more advanced areas, for example, of central and southern Gaul. These Alan settlements were placed in a line from essentially the channel, like imagine the mouth of the Seine in Normandy, in the north to Orléans in the south. So they were essentially between the channel and the Loire, that were also significantly connected. Now, I will not speculate on the other contexts. It could easily exist, also navally speaking, also in even amphibious raiding operations between the islands and this other various groups between Gaul and Britain, for example, against those rebels that also were hitting our. We made lots of videos about Gaelic warfare at this point and the various issues. It probably even involved some Scandinavian pirates, Viking style, right, to harass especially Britain. Everything, say, rhymes, like Twain said, historically, if it doesn't repeat itself properly. So by this deployment of the islands, Aetius was creating a thorn in the side to the so-called Tractus Armoricani. That was a frontier area, a bit like, imagine the Litus Saxonicum, right? There were some deep frontiers that the Romans fortified, and they counted on keeping the enemy, if not out, but still under check. And even if you had some of them settling, as it had been going on for quite a while, in those places you could still hope to absorb them. So having this ferocious nomadic, by now gradually sedentarized steppe warlords, like to crush any attempt to do something sneaky, let's say, was unitedly a good a good idea, right? So the Alans here could keep the Bacaudi under check throughout the entire region, because they could easily move from Orleans, that again is located in a very central part of Gaul, right? From north especially, but also the south, and so easily connecting with the Roman forces at some point as well. And you know that Aetius here was thinking big, because he had to cope with Attila's invasion, and that would hit Gaul as a matter of fact. In fact, this is the background. The Alans would join their forces, by the way, to put down Armorican rebellions. We know of Goar doing so in 445, 446, showing that they were effectively protecting the integrity of Roman Gaul. Of course, still noticing that they ruled over part of it, so it was just like an overlap in that regard. Similarly, was done in southern Gaul from the Alan colony in the Valentinois, because the Bacaudi were a bit everywhere, telling the truth, and southern Gaul was surely more civilized than the north, but these issues arose there as well. So shortly after the campaign of 445-46, Goar was succeeded by the aforementioned Sangiban as leader, at least of the Alans in the Orléanais and to the north. These are the years of Attila's plundering invasion of Gaul, right? In 451, in fact, the Alan contingent at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains from the Roman side is led by the same Sangiban, right? And this is, as you know, a massive battle in which the Romans and their German foederati succeed to crush Attila's forces that basically are proven to be incapable to defeat in open field the Roman army and for such a broader purpose, say of unstopped raiding into imperial territory. The Alans are fighting together with some Germanic foederati, by the way, on the Roman left, and they face the Gepids, other Germans, the Huns, right? We're talking about the Longobards recently. We do not have an explicit info there, but surely some Alan faced some Longobard in that section of the battlefield, and pretty interesting stuff surely happening in the memories of these peoples that, however, are unfortunately lost today. So the Alans contribute again to the Romano-Germanic success against the Huns in successfully defending Roman Gaul at Chalon, the Catalonian plains. In 452, Torismond, the Visigothic king, brings certain Alan settlements, probably located on the left bank of the Loire, so technically in Aquitaine, where the Visigoths had settled, under his control. However, he was murdered the next year, and we do not know whether the Visigothic control over these Alans remained. This is an interesting information from Gregory of Tours, by the way, because it shows that the rule here was between at least Alans and Germans, not meant in the more kind of territorially administrative sense that the Romans were habituated to handle, but somehow in a sort of lordship for which the relations, in this case between the Alans and the Visigoths, would remain somehow shaded depending on the situation. Maybe there had been fighting between the Visigoths and the Alans in order for the latter to recognize the former's overlordship. But such connections do not even seem, in fact, to have lasted particularly long. So again, the Alans were probably very independent-minded and didn't look favorably upon this sort of, let's say, taking over by peoples that evidently they had trouble up to that point to even claim their control over them, because if we know that Torismund did this at a point, just 1 year before getting killed, by the way, doesn't depose too much in favor of prior Alan subordination to the Germans at that point. In 457, an Alan contingent is raised in Gaul by the Emperor Majorian for his great campaign against the Vandals, which, however, turned into a disaster, so much so that the Western Roman Empire, that up to this point, while weakened, had stood on its feet, is recognized to undergo an unavoidable decline, given the persistence of the Vandals of Gaiseric in Africa that had successfully defeated the Western Roman Emperor in Spain, and that had even equally resisted against a massive Eastern Roman naval expedition, had been crushed at Cape Bon. So at that point, it was understood that the Italian resources, demographically and agriculturally, weren't enough to afford this mega project of reconquest of the West that with Majorian was happening. Right, he had basically conquered the Iberian Peninsula back, and the Vandals stood in the way, and so just for the single clashes, everything could be. But if it hadn't been for such a powerful leader like Gaiseric, the Western Roman Empire would have gone on, right? At least it would have not ended so soon, we think. And in this context, the Western Roman imperial authority is evaporating, even before Odoacer basically says, "Oh, okay, let's stop this formally as well." It's at this point that you can see the Alans throughout this, as you understood, picture of essentially loyalty, right, towards the empire, start getting less controllable, because the entire system was just falling apart, and so whoever was not taking part in the process, even just locally, because the Alans didn't have a force here to say even take the entirety of Gaul or anything, right? So, and they were in a way surviving and starting to raid around and so on, is exemplified by the same attempt of Majorian to tame them in the same Gaul, right? Just before basically being brought back to Italy by essentially the rise of Ricimer, this Swabian Visigothic leader who put him to death. Wu, in 464, would lead his own forces, in fact, against the same Alans, and at least on that occasion, severely defeating them. So this is also interesting because it still shows that who was ruling in Italy was capable of some important accession in at least southern Gaul, because this expedition had to do with the Alan king Beorgor, who was presumably Sambida's successor, at least in the Valentinois, and who was killed by Ricimer in the process. Of course, they all knew each other to some extent. I mean, they perfectly realized each other's code, beliefs, the Roman, the imperial fiction in the West was still kept alive, because in an administrative, institutional sense, but of course they were realizing that this thing had been fragmented and that none of them also was capable essentially of putting it together. So it was a pretty dramatic situation when you realize that even putting down a leader like Beorgor meant a significant contrast, right, happening between the various sides, and evidently the Alans here had turned into some sort of raiders, at least in those areas that they didn't control directly, and so from which they wanted to get more power for themselves with loot, plunder, and so what everybody in the game was doing. But maybe as Iranian people, they knew how, say, by inclination to do better somehow. But we're talking here about the essentially the second, even the third generation of settled Alans in Gaul. And at this point things start also blurring with the local Gallo-Romans, and also with the Franks, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Visigoths, that are the ones effectively in charge of the political and territorial extent, at least to a regional scale, while the Alans are just some of the lords that live in these places, some well located, some well entrenched, were fortified, again in strongholds that have not lost their strategic significance, but that are also probably observing how yes, a divided Gaul is probably the best opportunity for them individually to shine, but that there are bigger groups that are consolidating, monarchies. Here the Goths or the Burgundians are legislating the Roman way. The Franks are starting to push further from the northwest, etc. So the Alans individually can't do much to simply stem them. And they do participate in all these struggles, like in the best military tradition of those times and places. Now, during their first half century in Gaul, as we've seen, the Alan war bands preferred Roman connections to the barbarian ones. Goar becomes an imperial ally in 407, thus deserting the barbarians for Rome. And in spite of the fact that Goar had supported the usurper Jovinus in 411, there is no proof there that there was any destructive plan in terms of Roman leadership in Gaul by that point, which was still hegemonic, and that the Alans had been settled and thus legitimized in their possessions by, right? So this first attitude of the Alans is quite fascinating, to say the least, and it's maintained even as a tradition on the longer run, in times even of greater decay of Roman authority. Goar would have seen Jovinus as the handiest Roman, right, given that he was close to him, and surely someone with whom it was simply easier to relate with, given that he was operating in a Gallo-Roman context, and so not in a Romano-Italic one, like the one of the court of Ravenna. So when Jovinus was defeated, Goar didn't have to do anything about this. He, of course, had showed his colors at that point in favor of the usurper, but there was really nothing from Italy that could be done or said, or even profitably for themselves, just dislodge this Alans, because they were at the end of the day still keeping control of the situation there, recognizing at least indirectly the current establishment. And surely in Goar's mind, the sense that he was working on behalf of the divine imperium was never coming less, right? And even participating to these power struggles was still revolving around getting a part of that Roman power that all these barbarians had been looking like had been fantasizing for forever, right? In 442, we find Goar being given even the control of the Orléanais, one of the most essential and important lands in Gaul. We have on that instance an information from a chronicle telling us that the Gallo-Roman landowners weren't happy of the Alan settlement in the Orléanais, right? So the hospitalitas entailed normally this, not really a dispossession of the land. Like I literally give you 1/3 of the physical land of the place. It was just about income. But in this regard, it seems that the Gallo-Roman elite in that case was driven out. Right, they had other connections across Gaul. They had still lost an incredibly prestigious land. Orleans came from Aurelianus. Right, he had refounded the city, naming it Civitas Aurelianorum. Right, and so the sense that the unit, the symbol of the restoration of the empire, the integrity of it, was a prerogative even of this of the elite ruling this community, was probably deeply felt. Again, the Gallo-Romans were some of the most advanced, educated, Romanized elements of the entire empire. They were very rich and powerful, so they probably didn't accept, of course, that the Alans would simply take over. And it's likely that at that point the Alans themselves forced some sort of expropriation directly, and not some sort just of substitution of the local military to the local military for these people. They mostly acted as sort of lords, so this could be an indication that they, of course, of what everybody would have just preferred in absolute terms, not having this encumbrant nobility, especially when, as we will see now, that most of these peoples remained pagan, largely, differently again from the Franks that did instead the opposite thing here. They allied themselves exactly with the ultra elite of Gaul in order to achieve, in fact, much larger power. But this may have been a way for Aetius, rather, that settled the Alans in Orleans, to get rid of some, say, tricky elites that maybe were just somehow blackmailing him regarding the capacity of being the generalissimo in charge, fundamentally, and that were dispossessed by these Iranian warriors by his order. After all, we have seen how he could easily dispense of the Burgundians, crushing them, deporting them. These weren't tender-hearted people, right, from any side. So Aetius also had all a political goal here, and it's likely that the note about the Roman possessoris protest derives from this mechanism rather than some plain brutal settlement. Also because this was not in the first time of the invasion. This happens, in fact, in the 40s by Aetius in some of the most civilized places of Gaul, not like in the northeastern frontier. Right, so this is even more evident. It was done by the same Romans, right, by the same empire over these Gallo-Roman elites. When we look at Sangiban as Goar's successor, we also see that he was attached to Rome, definitely. He fought admirably. A chance to be sung in the epos that would survive somehow in the veins of Gallic literary culture and so on, in such a great clash against the Antichrist, like at least even from a pagan side, like the chthonic, the obscure, the anti-heroic, the anti-celestial leader Attila had crushed the same heavenly accomplishment, blessed by the rising sun of the Alans back in the Pontic steppe at the Catalonian plains. And on that occasion, the Alans held the center of the Roman line under severe pressure of the enemy. So they really sided with the Romans. They really bled for them, and this is one characteristic that, again, whenever the stories are told, it seems like these barbarians wanted to destroy Rome, or they were sacrificing themselves stupidly for her. On the contrary, right, the more they supported Rome, the more they could have for themselves, and it was a matter of enormous pride to support the ecumenic empire, of which they were, in this sense, feeling the highest parts of. right? So a completely diametrically different idea from the side of these barbarians who wanted to destroy Rome or having something even spiritually against her in the first place, which is an incredibly ignorant concept that could spread only among the populist fourth estaters of nationalist and or socialist background that unfortunately the word pullulates of nowadays. But don't worry, they will sink in the next things continue due to their own fault, by the way, to go on like this. So in any case, when we look at other authors, we have some partisan behavior. For example, the Goth Jordanus, writing in the mid-6th century, didn't like the Alans. He contended, for example, that Sangiban's loyalty to Rome was suspect, and that he was even plotting to surrender the same Orleans to the Huns on the occasion of, in fact, Attila's invasion of Gaul, without even fighting against him. Jordanus goes on to say that it was only the timely arrival of the Visigoths and the Romans which saved the city. Now, this is an interesting take because there's surely some truth in it. Jordanus was, not a particular, a radically reliable source in many ways, but surely here the concept is obvious politically and strategically. If you think that somebody's coming to blast you, and you think you can find a way out, if anything, because maybe you are actually and heroically resisting, but there may not be so much you can do at the end of the day, you may think to be negotiating, which surely was being done. I mean, everybody negotiated with everybody. This is completely normal at any time in history. Secretly so, because there were here sacred oaths, as we've seen, on the base of which the Imperium could be exclusively received. Otherwise, if you said a lie, you couldn't, right? It would be an indication to those who, use disinformatia as an identity, now they're pretending to win in wars. This is actually the issue. These peoples came from the most highly Apollonian concept that even a lie, even doing something that was not fully in synchrony with the world order, could make you destroy. And the highest you were, the most destructive the fall would occur. Other accounts regarding the Hunnic siege of Orleans, however, indicate that the city under Alan control underwent a bloody defense that was carried out bravely against the Hunnic onslaught, which makes you think about Jordanus' reliability, but could also be a sort of praise. In any case, Jordanus speaks from a background, but if you look at the famed Gallo-Roman Sidonius Apollinaris, who lived at the time of the same battle and in Gaul, by the way, suggests that the Visigoths' hesitation in taking the field was actually responsible for Attila's near success at Orleans. So he complains actually about the fact that the Visigoths were a bit wavering because they fear, like imagine just participating to the Battle of Catalonian Plains. In fact, they would suffer very heavy losses, notoriously. But it was a matter of big political choice. The Alans now were being besieged by the Huns themselves. Obviously, they were dealing with the thing somehow different. I made a video about Sidonius Apollinaris because it's one of, again, of the highest embodiment of Gallo-Roman high culture. So, the expression at that point of some of the highest world civilization. That is a fully Roman, again, it's the typically senatorially, backgrounded figure here that enlightens us through his work. Again, it's obvious that sources of the time were biased, and that they were writing for specific purposes. But you can understand that the events revolving the ultimately failed Hunnic siege of Orleans, and consequently the Alan success in defending the city, and the eventual participation to the Battle of the Catalonian Plains with that great role on the side of the Romans, is evident, right? And so Jordanus wrote badly of the Alans because he was pro-Gothic, right, mostly, and he wanted to say this bastards essentially are, there was a subtle hostility between the two groups for what had happened in Gaul in many ways, but you can imagine that there was this sense of the Goths having a sense of rivalry, even for some of the most advanced Iranians, because of the accomplishments in the Pontic steppe, in the Bosphorian kingdom, and so the strained relations that may have happened throughout all their history, by the way, as neighbors, like in all these tormented occasions. In any case, we don't have any evidence that Sangiban was actually treacherous in any of these situations described. So we cannot discount a negotiation with Attila again in the most desperate times of the siege of Orleans, before the arrival of the Romano Germans, and so the fact it was already negotiating with Attila, but this would have been done really by anyone in certain circumstances. So this Alan preference in Gaul for Roman rather than for other barbarian connections was also demonstrated in 414, which we have seen the Alans defecting the Germans at the siege of the Roman town of Bazas, and the following entering in imperial service and the settlement even a much more Romanized land than the ones that the Goths were trying to settle in on that occasion. Thus, the Romans trusted the Alans. This is what appears clearly. They trusted them to form the second line of defense in northeastern Gaul. They trusted them to settle in this more Romanized area in the south. They entrusted them under Aetius and the Hunnic invasions of the control of Orleans and of the Valentinois that were so strategically relevant. Right, so aside from the various bodyguards, etc., that could be a bit less of a political thing, at least compared to the various groups. But here we're talking about settled Alans in substantial numbers that get all this credit from the Roman side. Right, so when you realize that still in 457 there is an Alan contingent serving in Mazarin's army, fighting against the essentially the Goths and the Vandals, at the same time you realize which side they had picked. Admittedly, as we have seen, there would have been Alans among the same Vandals that Mazarin was fighting, but the Gallic ones, the Gallic Alans, proved, cooperative. They weren't saying, okay, well, screw you, Mazarin, we will never make you reconquer the whole West. They joined, and they said, let's even knock out those bastards in Africa. Actually in Spain, but still, settle in a land that after a Vandal defeat in Spain would have been likely taken over by the Westerners, even if the Eastern naval expedition had been successful, they would have rendered the land to Ravenna. To Rome. There is no doubt. All right. So, of course, we cannot so simplistically say, okay, so the Alans in Gaul were simply pro-Roman tout court. Not necessarily, but there was much there that probably the Alans understood as being a big deal with the integrity of the empire. Something for which they could get prestigious posts, land, and a future, right? In some of the most, again, Romanized lands in the world, right? And it's only after the disastrous defeat in Cartagena at the hands of the Vandals that the Alans in Gaul began to feel that Gaul was automatically shattered. Like the Italian forces were over, so there was no way simply even part of Gaul could be recovered. Right? Spain had been given the precedence, but these guys in Gaul had participated themselves in their constitution on the west, and now it was like, if not a free-for-all, and given the minority condition of the islands, still a good moment to start raiding around, but not because there was much against Rome per se. And so you can explain, in this sense, Beorgor's behavior, his raiding and plundering in southern Gaul during the summer of 461, the fact that Ricimer had to arrive and kill him, which still again tells how much force, after all, that at least the Italian peninsula could invest to crush this well-established lords in Gaul as well. And it's I would say it's fair to conclude that the island's preference for Rome derived immediately from these political gains, from the fact that they realized the advantages of a standing empire, the fact that they could enjoy some autonomous, decentralized position from Ravenna, and we can go as far as measuring Roman success in Gaul, imperial success in Gaul, through the behavior of the same islands. And so the fact that as long as the Roman state stood, everybody was with it, right? Of at least the most powerful forces. I mean, the Bacchaudi surely not, but these were the fringe kind of ghetto type of, realities. Here we have major warlords that obviously signed with the empire and civilization, which is a completely different thing. So this is a quite important take, and I would make a video about the islands in Gaul as far as their lifestyle, their even their cultural legacy, the fact that they were praised as warriors, how the Romans saw themselves, in another video, which I think is worth it as a general topic. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.